suicide bombings, Dr. Pape established that the probability of having a suicide bomber amongst any people increases 11 times over if their country falls under foreign occupation.
Very often, if you dig away at the root causes of areas and parts of the world where violent conflict has erupted, where terrorist activity has taken place, and it goes back to time immemorial, one sees at the heart of this very often issues not just of poverty, most likely, in my view, not of ignorance, but of a sense also of injustice at some wrong that has been done and that is continuing over time, that is not being addressed.
In my opinion, it's injustice, humiliation, oppression that are the most common causes of terrorism.
Some people claim that religion motivates terrorists. However, the academic research of Dr. Robert Pape has proved the claim to be false.
What I did is I collected the first complete database of every suicide terrorist attack around the world since 1980. The first version of this database was published a few years ago, and it went from 1980 to 2003. Think of that as like the pre-Iraq database, and then the second version from 2004 on, think of that as the data that's happened since Iraq. And what the data shows quite clearly is that the principal cause of suicide terrorism is foreign occupation. In that period from 1980 to 2003, there were 315 completed suicide terrorist attacks by 462 suicide terrorists who actually killed themselves. I don't mean attempts. These are people who actually killed themselves. The world leader during that 24-year period was not an Islamic group at all. They're the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. The Tamil Tigers are a Marxist group, a secular group, a Hindu group. In fact, over half of those 462 suicide attackers were purely secular, because you see many Muslim suicide terrorist groups are also purely secular, such as the PKK in Turkey. The PKK in Turkey, which did numerous suicide attacks in the 1990s, is again a Marxist, read anti-religious suicide terrorist group. Because you see, if Islam as sort of a radical religion, or if it were just radical Muslims doing this, then what you would expect is sort of this thin veneer of suicide attack kind of scattered all around the world. You would expect that, oh, there's 1.4 billion Muslims, you know, there's this teeny tiny fringe of Muslims kind of everywhere who'd be willing to do suicide attack, but that's not the way the data looks. It's really concentrated, and it's really concentrated in occupations.
If the definition of terrorism is targeting innocent civilians to force a political agenda, then a closer look at history reveals the troubling fact that governments have been engaging in terrorism.
One of the reasons that states have never been able to agree in the context of United Nations negotiations on the definition of terrorism is it's never been possible to find a form of words which excludes the possibility that states could in some way participate in terrorist acts. In short, of course states can be engaged in terrorism. If a state places an explosive or uses military force in a random way, harming civilians as part of a political objective, it may well meet the definition of terrorism in that 1997 convention.
Terrorism has been practiced by both governments and militants. In fact, before I did my work on terrorism, I spent 15 years studying air power. I wrote a book called Bombing to Win, which looked at all the uses of air power by states from World War I through the first Gulf War. Over 40 cases, major cases of air power in all. And in many of those cases, cases, air power was used by states to bomb civilians in the hope that bombing those civilians would produce political outcomes. In fact, that's often called terror bombing because it's a form of terrorism.
As the Second World War continued to expand, the deliberate bombing of cities and civilian populations by both the Axis and the Allied powers increased significantly. This was known as strategic bombing and was used as a psychological weapon to break the enemy's will to fight, to decrease its industrial production, and to push the civilian populations to revolt against their regimes. The strategic aerial bombardment in the European theater claimed the lives of over 60,000 British civilians and over 300,000 German civilians. Doubt about the effectiveness of bombing civilians in a conflict comes from the fact that despite the bombing of German cities, the country's industrial production increased throughout the war.
When you bomb civilians, it tends to almost always congeal the support of the civilians against you. That is, the civilians come to hate you. They come to see you as evil incarnate. We may tell ourselves, or the British may tell themselves, they're the good ones here and Hitler's the evil one. But who's killing 300,000 German civilians here? You see what I mean? So the German civilians are very much hating the British, causing them to fight on and make much greater sacrifices than they otherwise would, and in fact to support Hitler in doing some of the nastiest things Hitler was doing at the time. So that what's happening here is that this is backfiring in just about every way imaginable.
On Monday, the 6th of August, 1945, after 6 months of intense firebombing of 67 Japanese cities, an atomic bomb dubbed Little Boy was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, followed 3 days later by the detonation of a second bomb named the Fat Man over Nagasaki. As many as 140,000 Japanese civilians were killed as a result of the initial blast. And within weeks, the death toll increased to 250,000 as a result of radiation sickness. Within 5 years, the death toll exceeded 500,000 as resulting cancer and other long-term effects took hold. These are to date the only attacks with nuclear weapons in the history of humanity. During World War II, the Nazi regime committed a horrific genocide, killing civilians of non-Aryan ethnicities throughout Europe. Millions of Jews, Polish, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, Gypsies, and trade unionists were prosecuted and killed. In 1948, 50 years after Theodor Herzl established the first Zionist Congress, the State of Israel came to being, imposed on the land of Palestine. From this declaration onwards, using weapons recognized internationally as inhumane and illegal, the Israeli troops carried out systematic persecution, assassination, and mass killing of Palestine, including children. Of thousands of innocent Arabs were killed, and more than 5 million became homeless. Most of them became refugees in neighboring countries.
This is called state terrorism. For me, terrorism is when innocent civilians are targeted, no matter who targeted them, whether killed by so-called militants or government military forces. It is a crime and an act of terrorism.
Where's the case? Where's the case where bombing civilians with conventional bombs has actually won a war? We don't have very many. Maybe one, maybe two out of 40, 50 instances. that's not very much. And even those are probably apocryphal, probably not true. When we look at these cases, as I said, 40 cases from World War I to the 1991 Gulf War, many involving air power against civilians, we find no instances of that air power actually causing those civilians to abandon control of territory or to rise up and produce a popular revolt against their own government. In other words, it's not just that bombing civilians is immoral, it's ineffective. And that's a key message, because many people believe that in war we should kind of put morality aside and we should do what works. Well, if bombing civilians doesn't work, then what is the case for bombing civilians?
After the call to Islam became public, Prophet Muhammad and his followers endured 13 years of torture and persecution, simply because they were inviting the idol-worshipping tribes in Arabia to worship God alone. The perseverance and passive resistance displayed by the Muslims showed a great level of self-control and inner strength.
It was not only the weak companions and slaves who were subject to attacks at the hands of the Meccans. Also, companions of Prophet Muhammad from upper classes were not spared from one form of persecution or another, like Abu Bakr, who nearly died when he was beaten badly one day. It is worthy mentioning that the very first martyr in Islam was not a man at all, but a woman, Lady Sumayya, who was jabbed with a spear by Abu Jahl, one of the leaders of Quraysh, which proves that even women were not spared from persecution and killing.
To really appreciate the suffering and sacrifice of the early Muslims, one would just really need to look at some of the historical narrations about what happened in Mecca during those days. We talk about an embargo. We're not only talking about an economic embargo, we're talking about an embargo that affected family relations, social relations, friends, relatives, affected the economic situation of the Muslims, affected their religious freedoms and political freedoms. It was an embargo that encompassed the entire community. And we look back at some of the reports, we find people saying that they ate grass. Some of the Muslims, like Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, he actually ate grass to survive. He had no food. We read the reports about children who were crying and screaming who had no food, and Muslims would go to their brothers' markets, fellow non-Muslims, and be refused to be sold food, even though the food was right there in front of them. So this was not only an economic embargo, but also a spiritual embargo, a social embargo, and most importantly, a mental embargo, which was designed to shake the Muslim community from their faith.
To avoid getting captured by the Meccans, most Muslims had to immigrate secretly under the cover of the night, leaving behind all what they had of properties and memories. In Medina, 14 years after the beginning of the Prophet's mission, a revelation came from God permitting the Muslims to fight back.
Permission was not given to them for more than 14 years, despite all of the killing of victims and the suffering they endured, because their hearts were not yet ready to perform jihad.
The Quran gave permission to the Muslims to engage in combat with their persecutors for the first time. The Quran says, permission to fight back is given to those who are being fought because they have been wronged, and indeed, God is all able to give them victory.
This verse is clear in defining combative jihad. This combative jihad is in response to aggression and oppression and seeks to establish justice, which is a supreme goal, not only in Islamic teachings, but in every civilization. Establishing justice is a supreme goal. If you lose your homeland, well, Islam is encouraging Muslims to fight back and regain their freedom.
A lot of discussions and a lot of differences over why Muslims fight, what justifies a Muslim to carry arms against others. As a convert to Islam, definitely that was a question that I had. And in recent years, due to the events that we've seen all over the world and the tragedies and the killing of the innocents, I really had to do some soul searching. I was blessed to come and study in Al-Azhar University here in Egypt. And my 4th year of studies here, we actually studied an entire course on jihad. And in that book, it clearly states that the reason why Muslims fight is not because they're fighting people who don't believe in Islam, but that Muslims can fight even Muslims if there is a situation where injustice is being perpetrated against them. So the main reason for fighting in Islam, according to that text, which was written by a number of scholars, as well as the majority of classical Muslim jurists, is to repel injustice.
Muslim scholars throughout history explain the rulings of combative jihad, depending on the two primary sources of Islamic legislation, the Quran and the Sunnah.
The teachings of Prophet Muhammad mainly focused on two things. When it is allowed to go for combat, and if you go for combat, the do's and don'ts in combat.
According to the Quran, especially in chapter 22, in verses 39 to 40, one ground for jihad is to protect places of worship, such as monasteries, synagogues, churches, and mosques.
The Quran says, "For had God not decreed to repel some people by means of others, demolition would certainly have come to many monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques, in which the name of God is much mentioned in praise."
Another reason for jihad is failure to establish justice through peaceful means.
Combative jihad is allowed only if the establishment or restoration of justice through peaceful means has failed.
The Quran says, "Yet if they incline to peace, then you should also incline to it."
This is one of the main rulings in Islam, that Muslims cannot perform combative jihad if their enemy wants peace. And of course, peace doesn't mean just ceasefire. Peace means ceasefire, we are returning back your rights. So that was crystal clear in the Quran and in the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that Muslims should try to establish justice through all possible peaceful means. And if this happens, then Allah is opening no way for them to fight.
The Quran says, "Therefore, if they withdraw from you and fight not against you and offer you peace, then Allah accords you no lawful way to fight against them."
Peace always comes as the first option in Islam. One of the chapters of the Quran is called Al-Fath in Arabic, which means the manifest victory. And it starts like that. Surely we have granted you a manifest victory. And guess what? This victory was not in any battle. This victory was a peace treaty called Al-Hudaybiyah Peace Treaty. So what do you think about a book that calls a peace treaty a manifest victory? Is this book promoting peace or war?
Amongst the Prophet's teachings was the direction not to crave conflict. He said, "O people, do not look forward to meeting your enemies in battle and ask Allah to spare you from war. But if you meet them in battle, then stand firm." The right of a people to resist occupation by a foreign army is proving to be a powerful catalyst for many contrasting arguments in today's world.
One main reason for combative jihad, specifically called qital, meaning fighting, is legitimate self-defense to stop aggression. Another reason for jihad is to resist occupation.
One of the worst crimes that can occur to an oppressed people is the stealing and the taking of their land and property. Nearly in every ideology, the right of the oppressed people to stand up for their rights and fight the occupier is recognized.
Islam encourages Muslims to resist occupation, which is in fact considered to be a form of enslavement. This is clearly unacceptable and humiliating for the occupied people. Resisting occupation is considered a duty and an essential human right in many cultures. Emiliano Zapata, a leading figure in the Mexican Revolution, said, "It is better to die on your feet than live on your knees."
One of the groups of mujahideen were the founding fathers of the United States of America, who stood up against oppression, who resisted tyranny, but no one charges them with terrorism. The same can also be said about the French, who were great mujahideen in the face of Hitler and the Nazis.
Among the founding fathers of the United States of America, and one of the most prominent figures in the American Revolution, is Patrick Henry. He said, "Give me liberty or give me death."
No one can blame the founding fathers of the United States of America in fighting and resisting for the sake of freedom. Also, no one can blame the French for resisting and fighting the Nazis. It's common sense.
I think people have the right to resist occupation in a violent way under some circumstances. I think those circumstances held in the case of the American Revolution and created what became the United States. I think that the circumstances are where the foreign government, the foreign occupier, are abusing the population, and where there's a fairly broad consensus among the local population and the leaders of the local population that that is in fact occurring. The United States was founded on a revolution. It was a right of the people to overthrow an abusive government. This was something that was enshrined in our Declaration of Independence. This is what the Declaration is all about.
In occupied territories, it is plain there are going to be a community of individuals who are going to resist the occupation. Whether you talk about occupation during the Second World War or occupation in more recent times, there are going to be circumstances in which a great number of people are going to consider that some form of resistance is lawful and legitimate and justified. The question is, what are the limits in law on what you can do? And it comes back again to these very simple principles that I keep saying. It may well be permissible to target through force, through violence, military objectives, but what you can't ever do is expose civilian populations to the threat or to the use of force. Once you do that, even in a situation of occupation or unlawful domination, you are crossing a line, just as a state crosses a line when it ever uses violent weaponry against civilian targets.
To serve their hidden agenda, some people wrongly present verses of the Quran in order to deceive those who don't have sufficient knowledge of Islam.
Take, for example, some people say, how come Muslims are having in their book, fight in the cause of Allah? They should have love in the cause of Allah like other religions. But again, the same immoral cut and paste game is played against Muslims. The verse actually says, fight in the cause of Allah, those who fight against you. But they don't continue the verse, and they take the words out of context, playing this game always against us.
The Quran says, "And fight in the cause of God those who fight against you, but begin not hostilities. Indeed, God does not love those who commit aggression."
A major problem within the Muslim community as well as outside of it is what I call drive-through jurists or cut-and-paste jurists. Those people, whether they're Muslims or not, who take, splice up verses, edit them, add a little TiVo, or maybe even give it a little, a cut and paste job here and there, and present verses and statements of the Prophet, peace be upon him, either which are not complete or out of context, using those verses and using those statements of the Prophet to justify egregious actions.
Some people say, how come Muslims are having in their book, kill them wherever you find them? As if the Quran is only encouraging Muslims to kill non-Muslims, as if Muslims should walk with 2 machine guns to kill non-Muslims wherever they find them. But they are playing the same immoral cut and paste game. If you read the verse as a whole, it says, kill them wherever you find them and drive them out from where they drove you out. This verse is telling Muslims to fight their occupiers and regain back the freedom of their homeland. One of the clearest proofs that combative jihad is only to establish justice is that it is allowed for Muslims to launch jihad against Muslims too, if they are the transgressing party. And this is not my own opinion, this is the very words of the Quran. It's very clear in the Quran that if Muslims are oppressors, they can be fought against. So it doesn't matter who's Muslim and who's not, but what matters is who's an oppressor and who's oppressed.
And if 2 groups of the believers fight amongst themselves, then reconcile between them both. But if one of them rebels against the other, then fight you all against the one that which rebels until it complies with the command of Allah. And if it complies, then make reconciliation between them justly.
A powerful verse which illustrates the profound sense of justice in Islam. And it clearly expresses that Muslims are not ordered to fight people of other faiths simply because they share a different faith than Muslims. But it illustrates that Muslims are ordered to fight against oppression wherever it comes from.